Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick,
And I'm Gemma Files.
and this, of course, is No
No
Dark
darkness but
But
ours.
Ours. We began our exploration of lesbian horror with one of its foundational texts, J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which we continue to discuss in this episode. We'll also be talking about the horror fiction of Vernon Lee, various film adaptations of Carmilla, including the most recent by Emily Harris in 2019, and at the end of the last episode we were comparing Carmilla with that other iconic vampire, Dracula. And now we look at possible historical inspirations for those two monsters.
It's debatable whether or not there actually is that much of a line between actual factual Vlad Tepes and Dracula, especially considering that he was originally going to be named Count Vampire, Count Vampire.
For fuck's sake.
Yeah, seriously.
Or not even count, edit math, sort of.
But the person who usually comes into things when you start talking about lesbian vampires is Erszebet Bathory, and
Yes.
And Erszebet Bathory, on the other hand, did not seduce people. She was a super ass, aristocrat. She was an aristocrat in Vlad's mold. She was related to him. They were separated by
those who are beneath us.
Exactly. It's like she reminds me far more of Gilles de Rais, because like Gilles de Rais, she would essentially buy people's kids, and hire them as servants, and then do whatever the fuck she wanted with them. And things. Yeah, exactly. And things only started to, if you believe all what people say, then things only started to get bad for her socially when she began to prey on people of her own class.
Then people
were sort of like,
bleed the peasants white. That's just doing literally what we do metaphorically.
Exactly. But she was not a seductive person. She was not a person who was trading on her vulnerability. I mean, although she did used to have really bad migraines, and stay in bed for days at a time, and possibly had epilepsy. But when things like that happened to her, she would literally have people drag people into her room so that she could bite chunks off of them without having to get out of bed.
Well, of course, one of the differences with her was she was a woman in the unusual position of being in that of direct authority over those estates. Normally,
absolute power.
I think it was because after her husband died, she basically ended up in charge of the estate because there wasn't any male person for it to pass on.
And Ferenc Nadashti had actually, when he married her, he agreed to take her name because the Bathorys were of higher station.
Right.
The Bathorys were law unto themselves. They have a very weird mythic background, which involves having their oldest ancestor having become a lord because he killed a dragon.
Have you read Peter Tremaine's Dracula Unborn?
No.
It's rather fun. He wrote it as a very plausibly done prequel to or origin story for Dracula, and he'd obviously researched the historical background very closely. It's presented as a memoir by Mercia, who was his third son, about who very little is known. And in this narrative, I think his first wife was supposedly who historically I think was killed. In fact, escaped with Mercia, and her maid who'd helped her escape was thrown to her death in the battlements, and the word given out that was the mother.
Yes.
And anyway, then he it's like this is like Italy in the 1400s. He finds he's been brought up as like a Venetian, and then he learns that his father's dead, and his brothers Vlad the Younger and Mihai, invite him to to claim this part of their inheritance, and so he goes to Wallachia. It's very brilliantly researched, but there is this woman who's supposed to be marrying one of his brothers, and she is actually a countess of the Bathorys.
Interesting.
This is before Erszebet came along. It's just kind of like, but she talks about how there were two branches of the family, and one of which is known for its cruel aberrations of character and sadistic tendencies, kind of thing. But so that's better.
which is really funny, because the Bathorys were totally known for that.
Yeah, it's worth a read if you can get hold of it. But it's just presented as it's very much in the traditional kind of old-fashioned vampire fiction mold. But it's done. But he's clearly done his historical homework and all the rest of it, and it's just. I mean, I almost had me believing the vampires were real, quite frankly. But then again, I was a very impressionable young lad, and not very bright in that sense.
Anyway, so okay, so so with this we have like really sort of the beginning of an introduction of lesbianism in, like overtly. And even so, when we say overtly, it's like,
overtly by the standards of the time. Although, of course, this was still the work that was written by a straight male.
Yes.
So we get to see
by a straight male
actual fiction written by queer women.
Yes. We were talking a little bit about Vernon Lee, who was very much a lesbian, and wrote amazing Gothic horror. And I was making the point that that although that she very much kept her actual sexuality kind of off the page. I think she was interested in a particular emotional matrix, which is always there. And it is a very much it's a Gothic matrix. It's a matrix of people being fatal, and often femme fatale, not homme fatale, but the people who suffer because of these people are usually male, and in one case, with a wicked voice, it's a guy who is sort of vampirized psychically by the ghost of a castrato. Yeah, and he's a guy who is a musician, and he's obsessed with music, and he somehow manages to sort of insult the ghost of a famous castrato. And begins to hear this wicked voice. Supposedly, when this guy was alive, he was able to, through magical castrato powers, he was able to seduce people and even kill them long distance. Wow. He could make them die from listening to his voice. And this guy's like, yeah, I think that's bullshit. And then
he was kind of like Nickelback, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big cruel. Poor Nickelback.
I don't hate Nickelback. They're not the best band in the world, but they have made some really good workout songs. Like ridiculous songs about getting super drunk and fighting people. Which is a genre I'm fond of. Anyway. So, in things like Oak of Oakhurst, again, it's like Mrs. Oak is perversely in love with a ghost and has remade herself in the image of the Mrs. Oak of Oakhurst who killed her husband with this guy back in the day.
Right.
And by doing this, by falling in love with this ghost and by becoming obsessed with that story, is essentially killing her husband by making him so depressed and embarrassed, and it's like sucking the life out of him. or Amour dur, where Professor Spiridon is researching the life of a woman who's very obviously based on Lucrezia Borgia, sort of like a cross between Lucrezia Borgia and Caterina Sforza. And she and while she was alive, she was able to bewitch anybody, just by being any guy, essentially, by being in their presence. And indeed was only killed when a guy paid women to go in and kill her, to go in and like strangle her with a cord. And
good thing those women were obviously immune to her charms.
Yeah, they were immune to her charms. So odd considering Vernon Lee.
There was that thing, wasn't there, about I saw doing the rounds on Facebook about how the Mars mission, how the Mars mission might be all women, but to stop the crew from having sex on the 1.5 year journey, and you're like,
yeah, and you're looking at this team, and it's like some of the hottest ladies, it's like athletic, tall, short, it's like super butch, super not butch, it's like, oh, I wish those dames a lot of non-sex on that mission. I hope they have fun being not attracted to each other and not acting on it. I mean, it occurs to me that, the people who could get away with having sex in space would be more likely to be lesbians, but that's me. Anyway,
pregnancy is less of unplanned pregnancy is less of an issue than it would.
Well, yeah, and even sperm is less of an issue.
Well, yeah. Because I mean, there is that. I think I did see something about there was at one point I was because I was fascinated with the whole lost cosmonauts mythology.
Oh, yeah.
This whole idea.
The lady who supposedly burnt up in the atmosphere. She was coming back down.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. But essentially, what I mean, the Soviets obviously succeeded in getting there first with an awful lot of aspects of the space race, but and often with far fewer resources than the Americans. But
yes,
they did very much tend to bury their failures. Yuri Gagarin's flight wasn't announced until he was safely back down on Earth, because
like if he dies, we're just not getting into it.
A guy called Valentin Bondarenko, he was actually the youngest of the original cosmonaut training group, died in this dreadful accident. They were all working in pressurized chambers to sort of simulate, to kind of get them used to what they were doing. It was a pure oxygen atmosphere.
Oh, right.
They had electrodes attached to monitor the heart rate and stuff. And he took off, he removed the things, swabbed, used an alcohol swab where they removed the adhesive, and then just tossed it at the waste bin. But he missed the waste bin, it hit the hot plate.
Oh my God.
And because it was a pure oxygen atmosphere, it just went woomph. And they tried to get the hatch open to get him out, and it locked. And it took them 20 minutes to prise it off. And when they got him into hospital, they had to put the IV into the soles of his feet, because that was the only unburnt skin.
Oh,
and
my God.
I can't remember how long he survived, a number of hours. I mean, and a guy at the hospital there was an Air Force major with him, kind of like, sort of sitting with him, doing the death watch kind of thing. And he recognized the guy a few months later, was when he was all over the TV, a Major Yuri Gagarin.
Oh.
But what happened was, Bondarenko's records were altered to basically remove any reference to him ever having been a cosmonaut trainee, and he was officially listed as having been killed in a plane accident.
Yeah.
So all the cosmonauts were taken from the Air Force, so he was listed as having died in a training accident, and he was airbrushed out of all the training photos. Now, a few others who kind of not necessarily died, but washed out of the program in one way or another, were similarly airbrushed. And of course, this gave rise, because people in the West could obviously see the different versions of the photographs, what's going on. So there's been a good deal of speculation that the Russians may have sent up more manned missions than they actually admitted to, because some of them went horribly wrong and they didn't survive. So, and a couple of Italian brothers at the Torrebert state, with it basically pair of amateur have made all sorts of claims claiming to have intercepted these various transmissions, some of which have been debunked, I believe. But anyway, I was kind of researching the whole, the idea of, there was supposed to be one account of a spacecraft that had kind of gone flying out of Earth orbit, which actually would have been impossible at that time. None of these vehicles had second stage rockets that would give them escape velocity. But anyway, it was kind of like, what happens if this comes drifting back and there's a body on board, and then suddenly the body comes back to life?
Yes.
A space zombie way. But trying to research that, I mean, I think I got bogged down so much in all the technical side of things that I couldn't even begin. But
that's great, though. I mean, we should talk about space horror at some point, because I am so afraid of space. I can't even fucking tell you.
Oh God, yeah. Just even doing that kind of research was kind of like, Jesus Christ, this shit's scary.
Oh yeah.
But there were a lot of questions. There went on things like sites like Quora, where people were asking all sorts of questions. But there were questions like, what do people have sex in space? As in, had ever had sex on the International Space Station, or do people jerk off there? And I think it was kind of like, it would be there'd be that much trouble, to try, just never mind, just because everything's floating around.
Exactly. I mean,
out for yourself, never mind with another person. But yes, you kind of, because of how liquids, if they get into the air, kind of float around, you
really don't want to be doing that. It's like,
so girl on girl has got a lot of advantages in that point of view. You don't have to worry quite as much. Well, there are still,
a little bit,
be a squirter.
Yeah. But keep your pants on.
That dragging sound you can hear is the tone of the conversation. On the
sorry.
floor again. No, it's me. It's me.
No. Well, I'm going there too. Anyway, so yeah, in a lot of ways, with Carmilla, we set the template for not just female vampire horror, but also lesbian horror. In the beginning, it's like lesbians come at you. They come at you from the side. It's like they insert themselves into your life. It's like Carmilla is and they drain you. It's like their love is perverse.
Drinking your precious bodily fluids, kind of.
Yeah, it's like their love is. I mean, as I recall, doesn't Laura actually die? And
no, she does survive.
Does survive, because
she's dead by the time
she's dead by the time
the narrative is presented to us as being among the papers of the late Dr. Martin Hesselius, along with Green Tea and mentioned the others in.
That's right.
Stories in A Glass Darkly. And the guy who's telling the story said basically the lady who told it was a very old, woman now. It happened many years ago.
Yes.
And he tried to get in touch with her, but she'd since died. But I mean, I think the implication was no implication that any supernatural agency had been involved. She just,
Okay, so that's interesting, because I've seen it interpreted a couple of different ways on screen in better versions of Carmilla than the Vampire Lovers. There was actually a very good one set during Civil War era America, with Ione Skye as Laura and Meg Tilly as Carmilla.
Okay.
And I seem to recall that Laura dies at the end of that. She doesn't become a vampire, but she does die.
I mean, in the more recent adaptation with had Jessica Raine taking a very dominant role as the governess, whose role is much amplified from the original text.
Yes, and she's obsessed with the idea that these two girls are lesbians. And then she becomes obsessed via the doctor character with the idea that they are actually vampires. And it's like, would it be worse to be a lesbian or worse to be a vampire? Or, and the two of them essentially end up killing Carmilla by,
the traditional stake through the heart.
Traditional stake through the heart.
More kind of ambiguous in that adaptation as to whether Carmilla is actually a vampire. And an interesting touch, which is something that's been kind of grafted onto the narrative, is this whole thing of Laura being left-handed.
Yes.
And her arm, and it's at the beginning of the film we
Stop
see her
being perverse and wanting to, write with your left hand.
At the beginning of the film, you see her throwing stones into a lake, and I think she's using her left hand there.
That's right.
And when you see her at the very end, she's throwing stones into the lake again, but this time she's using her right hand, indicating that she's, I suppose, indicating she's been normalized, but equating that with sort of like, in much the same, if eradication of lesbian impulses is to make somebody normal, it's on the same level as forcing them to use their right hand instead of their left. It's not actually, it's not big and it's not clever. It's just small-minded prejudice rather than
it's totally small-minded prejudice. But it also comes from the idea that it's the Dexter, it's the sinister, the sinister hand.
I'm just looking at the prologue of Carmilla now. Let's see. Blah 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 blah.
And it feeds into the idea that you can choose your sexuality, that you can choose not to be gay, that you can train yourself not to be gay. That,
Yes. Here's what it says in the prologue about from the author. Fanu, kind of judging them. Yes. I was anxious on discovering this paper to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before with a person so clever and careful as his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found she had died in the interval. So that so many years before, of course, could mean anything from like 10 to 50. So she could have died of old age or natural causes, or she could have. There's certainly the end of the story. I think she's indicated that she's always, that even now she still sometimes starts because she thinks she can hear Carmilla's
light footstep
or something like that. So whether she's just haunted on a psychological level or something else. So you can make other interpretations there if you so.
Yeah, and Le Fanu is wonderful that way. I mean, he really was like a forerunner to Henry James in that particular way.
Yeah.
So much of his stuff can be interpreted in an absolutely psychological horror way. I thought
of the turn of this. I mean, when I was watching that more recent adaptation we were just talking, the one with Jessica Raine as the governess, I kept forgetting the names of the two lead actresses.
But it's the one that's on Shudder.
Yes. But I was very much put in mind of the turn of the screen because I mean, one thing that's not there are ambiguities about some things, we can say in Carmilla, but there is no ambiguity about the fact that Carmilla is a vampire. We're not, it's not sort of, it's not a text where you can come away with the sort of the whole, she's just a figment of someone's it's just a figment of someone's imagination in that sense. But there was a lot more of the kind of loading, making the narrative, there seems to be a lot of making the narrative a lot more ambiguous in that sense about what Carmilla really was, what the true nature of that relationship with the girl between her and Laura, or Lara, I think she's in the film.
Well, and also, you can think of her blood drinking as a type of fetishism as well, because Laura's relationship with the governess up to that point has essentially been like a BDSM relationship.
God, yes.
That the governess is kind of channeling whatever's going on inside of her into I have been given Raine to torment this girl, to punish this girl on a regular basis.
She also says to stop her making the same mistakes she did.
Yes, that's right.
She does have this thing. Again, this is something that I don't think that is external. It's not in the book, but it is very, she sort of the governess indicates that at one time she thought she was in love and with somebody that she doesn't specify who. Doesn't specify if it was a lesbian relationship or not, but I'll bet you $5 that it probably was. She was probably at one of those Jane Eyre schools, and it was like I was in love with this girl and then she died of like scarlet fever or something. Or she got married and I was horribly, horribly broken. Yeah, but I mean, either way, she sort of said it affected the whole course of my life. I don't want you making the same mistakes you do. I mean, the the worst evil is done by people who think they're doing good. And I think that's actually a sentiment that crops up in that adaptation as well.
Yes.
That you know.
Yeah.
So
and so, you know, I mean, in a strange way, it's like the trappings of BDSM, the trappings of sadomasochism, the trappings of you know, like self-harm, because Laura does hurt herself because she's in this.
She burns her hand with candle flame. She pricks her finger.
And a lot of women do that. A lot of, you know, women who are in situations where, you know, their emotions are, you know, I've done that, you know, are becoming incredibly hard to deal with. You know, you end up, it's like, it's sort of like an internalization of the I'll give you something to cry about thing, you know, where it's like real pain to get rid of the emotional pain, to bring out the emotional pain. If I cut a little hole in myself, maybe all of this will come out. And then again, you can very easily kind of train yourself to depend on that in an almost masturbatory way, in a strange kind of like, you know, it's like I need this behavior. I need this behavior. And it becomes like, again, a lobe of your sexuality, which is being, you know, smothered inside of this weird sort of, you know.
Next week we return to the works of Vernon Lee, and we'll also be talking about Marjorie Bowen, Louisa May Alcott, and much more besides.
Until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
And I've been Gemma Files, and this, of course, has been No Darkness, But Ours.